All
right, so welcome everyone to our first paper panel, which is Andor and Rebellion. It is my very special privilege to introduce Dr. Jen Spindel, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire. A true sci-fi nerd at heart, she incorporates Star Wars simulations into her courses on national and international security. Beyond Star Wars, her research focuses mainly on the arms trade, alliances, and civil military relations. She conducts fieldwork at international weapons exhibitions and is waiting for someone to develop a lightsaber. And we'll be presenting paper, The Narrative Strikes Back, the symbols and ideas that sustain rebel movements. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So this is a project that I've been working on with two of our fantastic graduating seniors at UNH, Emily Lanu and Zoe Flynn. And so I'm just going to dive right in. So I think one of the things that's really interesting in Andor is the way that it highlights the varieties of rebellion and the varieties of organizations that take part. You've got everyone from Saw Gerrera and the Partisans to the Maya Pi Brigade, Neo-Republicans supported by Luthen Maybe, right? Anton Krieger, who's sold out by Luthen, who's a separatist. You've got the Gorman Front. There's a lot of stuff going on, right? And I think Saw actually sort of captures the kind of chaos of the early stages of the rebellion by saying Krieger's a separatist, Maya Pi is a neo-Republican, the Gorman Front, the Partisan Alliance, sectorists, human cultists, galaxy partitionists, they're all lost. All of them lost. And so I think what we're really confronted with throughout Andor is this sense that there is a sort of fragmented, loosely connected network of rebel-ish people, right? So I've sort of attempted to just visualize that here in a sort of flat plane, but I actually think it's worth thinking about sort of how these networks are embedded and layered. Thank you, Claude, for the 3D model of my network, right? And so why is that an interesting question? Well, I think because the rebel alliance that we come to know through the movie saga, certainly the only movies that count, right? 4, 5, and 6, is a military alliance with a hierarchical organization, rules, and norms. So how did we get from here to a much more densely connected network? And so this is a project that started when we first started talking about this conference as wanting to look at Nemec's manifesto as a sort of artifact that helped link groups together. And I was going to compare that manifesto to manifestos of the past and think about sort of what is the combination of means and ideas that allows a group to sort of unify, to be taken seriously, and to make a real impact on world politics. I mean, how did the Rebel Alliance go from this fragmented network where there was frequent infighting to a much more densely connected group that can, in fact, challenge the empire? But as I started digging into this, I couldn't help but notice the ways that, as Patrick kind of foreshadowed for us, the way that symbols and words and phrases from Andor were coming up in the real world and spreading quickly. And so what happened was that the project shifted quite distinctly. So this is a screen grab of a post from the r/Andor subreddit from June of 2025. It is a collage, so around the border of the I Have Friends Everywhere, which yes is what my t-shirt says, are posters that were used around the world at one of the first No Kings rallies. And it was accompanied by this text, which said, I felt inspired by the thread of I Have Everywhere signs. These are photos from protests all over the country. We really do have friends everywhere. And this is the collage of the poster put together. And so as I was thinking about this sort of alongside Andor, I was thinking about the different groups that have used or referenced symbols and ideas from Andor in trying to build and sustain a political movement right now at this very moment in time. And I think it shares a lot of structural similarities to the Rebel Alliance we see in Andor. So there are the big groups, right? You've got Indivisible. Maybe that's your Luthen. You've got the No Kings. I don't know, maybe that's my mom, right? You've got the Never Trump. Maybe that's the sort of loyalists, right? But they're supplemented, connected to, with thin ties, sometimes with ties that were very, very surprising to groups from a lot of different domains. So these are the logos of just a handful of groups that have spoken out using similar language. The American Medical Association, the American Association of University Professors, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, all echoing ideas that are drawing from no kings and indivisible, that are themselves relying on symbols and phrases from Andor. But it doesn't stop there, right? These groups spread and spread and spread. Are they all lost, as Saw Gerrera said? I don't think so, right? So you've got this sort of organizational diversity happening here. What's interesting about this is the way that it then filters down into individual actions. And I'm going to just show you some of the ones that I think are particularly interesting. So, Nemec's manifesto, right? Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Whether that's weird or that's an oblique reference to the Force, I think we can sort of think about, right? But here's how this inspires individual action. You might have heard of the high school kid from Indiana who punched a neo-fascist. There was an 87-year-old veteran arrested in DC for protesting outside the Capitol. An 82-year-old in London protesting on similar terms, policies in the UK. And of course, Lady Liberty arrested in Los Angeles, California. These individual actions aggregate up to more organized protests. And these are just highway overpass protests from around the United States. They are all sort of drawing on one another, drawing similar inspiration, right? And so I really think the question here is, what are these symbols and icons that build a movement? How do they take this ragtag group of rebels and turn it into the rebel alliance that we know? This screenshot quoting Nemec's manifesto was from a Reddit post in June 2025. So there's this pattern of images and symbols from Andor and larger Star Wars. And what I think they do is signify a shared understanding of the world. They are a marker of belonging, and they're carrying a clear and pretty concise message. In the same way that Nemec's manifesto is about 1/100th the length of many of the manifestos from real history, these messages are pretty succinct. Resist, fascism's bad, ice out, no kings. Easily understandable, and they span time and space. And as I dug into the subreddit and the sort of networks that it has spawned, it wasn't just in the United States. It was in Thailand, Iran, Brazil, and all over the US. I think there's a very fair question about, does this actually lead to real world policy change, which I'm going to put a pin in and come back to at the end, right? But I want to just spend a few minutes thinking about why Andor? Why is Nemec's manifesto this thing that seems to be inspiring protests and resistance? Here's a post from our Andor that I think really gets to this. What I really appreciate about Nemec's writing is the last word, try. It is a philosophical counter to Yoda's do or not do. There is no try. And so I think Andor is a manifesto and a sentiment for a fledgling movement, right? It unites groups that share concerns, but have not yet massed into the rebel alliance. The manifesto, the way that it has been picked up, represents the fractured politics in the United States of the Democratic Party, the struggle between loyalists, maybe Chuck Schumer, separatists, maybe AOC, right? The partisans and all these other divisions. Nemec's manifesto does not expect a movement with clear direction, nor does it expect a movement with full unity of purpose. And it doesn't expect these things to emerge fully formed. What it recognizes, and why I think it inspires this around the world, supposed to there is no try, is it recognizes those feelings of hopelessness and of isolation, of uncertainty, and of concerns about the futility of not being able to do. So it centers try as the goal, which I think is very appropriate for the time and place of Andor and of right now in world time. So this message translates across place and time. And importantly, it's adaptable to real world events. I'm going to show you some very concrete examples of that in a moment. But I think there's also a really important plausible deniability element here. When you carry a sign that is Nemec's manifesto, you are plausibly talking about Star Wars and not necessarily about Donald Trump. It gives you deniability and the ability to talk about a taboo or a dangerous topic by referencing this fictional universe that we all know about and we all share some knowledge of. The Galactic Empire is the fascist government. And because we all know how the story ends, maybe there is hope, right? You have Jyn Erso's rebellions are built on hope that is echoed repeatedly through Andor. That took 6 to 9 movies, depending on your feelings about the prequels, to reach that overthrow of the Galactic Empire, right? So this isn't a fast, easy solution. And I think as Patrick just shared with us, there's actually minimal reference to the Force in Andor. I think that's critical, because it raises the question of whether or not people can control their own fate. It recenters choosing to protest as an active political choice that is meaningful. And it suggests that outcomes are not foretold, that you are not doing things because the Force wills it, but because you choose it and you think there is meaning and there is potential in those actions. That defending is how you win. And I think Patrick hit that nail really on the head for us, right? That this isn't about attacking. It's not about being violent. It is about defending and, importantly, choosing to defend. So let me show you how the general public, and the general public that uses Andor and Reddit, is starting to think about what this show means and why it inspired rebellion. So these are screen grabs of Andor. We in fact saw this image on the right last night. What is the reference to? The Epstein files. Why aren't the Epstein files being released? Well, the stock market is doing really great. And so one of the sort of genres of interlinking with Andor, right, is sort of taking screen grabs and either replacing words with real word, right, the Dow, or on the image on the left, the Corellian Stock Exchange, right? So again, you're using this sort of plausibly deniable universe to make a joke that everyone understands, right? Why aren't the Epstein files being released? The stock market. And I think what's sort of poignant about this Cyril image here is that when you realize the extent of the corruption and lies, as he does in that episode, just as the Epstein files are sort of pushed to the side as the stock market, went over, it's almost too late, right? So I think it's calling that out. One of the other ways that Andor sort of talks about real world events, right, is by posting a screen grab of the movie. This is not a post about Star Wars, it's about Pam Bondi, right? So what happens when things go poorly in the Star Wars universe? Why do you resist? Why don't you join the Empire? Well, because you will be Dedra. You will reap the consequences of your commitment to the fascist regime. In the real world, Pam Bondi was a convenient woman, and it's important to note the gender dynamics there, right? To fire when the stock market started to tumble. And so the AI generated image putting Pam Bondi onto Dedra, right, I think implicitly signals we all get that this is the joke and we're all in on it. It starts to get a little darker, right? But I think what Andor does and what Star Wars does is gives people the images and the language to talk about horrors that seemed too real to contemplate. What does it mean for a whole civilization to die, to be wiped out? I don't think we have the language to deal with that, but Star Wars does, right? Because Alderaan was destroyed by the Death Star. And so I think what this does is it lets the image of brutality and destruction speak for real world brutality that seems too insane to actually imagine, right? And so, yes, this is the actual screen grab from Donald Trump's Truth Social post. I don't recommend going onto that site to get these screen grabs, but sometimes one must in the service of research. But this theme of juxtaposing Donald Trump and someone from Star Wars really sort of occurred throughout, and I think speaks to the sort of adaptability, right? So in April of this year, right, Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one. Note the praise be to Allah at the end, right? Because here's the parody of it on Andor. Right? Does anyone else miss when we had a director of advanced weapons research who was normal? Right? And so what are we saying? We are referencing the Gorman massacre, right? Tuesday will be massacre day. Give me the deep fucking substrate, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to God. Right? So we're mirroring the tone. We're mirroring the language. We're mirroring the sentiment in ways that capture deep, deep horrors right? And I think sort of make that message understandable to others. In the episode right before the one we watched last night, this is direct quote from Andor. This is not sort of changed to match real world events, but the title to this post was Andor is so damned pertinent. Every day, in every way, friends everywhere. Right? So people are starting to say, not only can we read our realities into this show, but the show is actually reflecting back to us things that we are experiencing. And it is that reflection that is meaningful and ties people together. Right here, Mon Mothma is talking to the senator from Gorman, who we saw arrested and dragged away last night because he dared to challenge the imperial narrative. I think we could spend many, many, many hours coming up with real world examples, right, of this scenario. There are also ways that this is moving into the physical world. So this is one of my favorites. This is a billboard scene advertising Andor, right? And what is Luthen saying? Fuck ice, right? And the message on the sort of Redditor posting this was one billboard, two vital messages. Message one, Andor's awesome. Message two, fuck ice, right? And you start to see this moving into art and signs like this being carried at protests. So yes, we have the confrontation between the rebel and the stormtrooper, but who is that actually standing in for? ICE and a Minneapolis protester, right? And so as this starts moving off the screen and off the internet into the real world, you start seeing things like this. So rebel logos incorporated into the physical world. So in the middle, this was someone posting the Rebel Alliance logo from their textbook on Palestine and on Palestinian resistance. On the right here, the Minnesota professional women's hockey team has taken the Rebel Alliance logo, counterimposed with the state bird of the loon, and is selling that. Yeah, for profit, right? Though note this is a fundraiser, because that symbol is meaningful. And in some ways, it escalates to really interesting levels. So the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier is the world's largest ship ever made. It entered service in 2017 with a cost somewhere between $13 and $18 billion. The Navy had to investigate whether sailors were deliberately setting fire to their own ship to end deployment. Where is it being sent? Middle East, right? And so you're seeing random acts of insurrection that, as this Redditor says, are exactly what Nemec talked about. Those acts that occur in distant corners of the galaxy with no direction from above, but because people recognize the same truth, right? This became quite real in Minneapolis. I went to grad school at the University of Minnesota, right? So this have a lot of people on the ground there. So one of the posts cross-posted from Twitter to Reddit from the Twitter account called Fuck Ice, said that, look, I'm seeing Nemec's manifesto in the wild in the context of ICE murdering civilians. After Renee Good and Alex Preti were murdered, you see this type of imagery popping up. So that's the quote, right? I have friends everywhere. The code that you belong, that you are a member of this ragtag rebellion. And again, what's the symbol at the top? It's the rebel logo with the Minnesota loon, right? The rebel birds. And showing, I think, the adaptability of Andor, the narrative and the meaning, you actually start to see the rebel birds migrating and being representative of states across the nation. The artist who made most of these, he's called 4.5 Cantina Mercantile, sells them for very, very, little bit of amount of money, and has posted them all to Reddit for people to use, right? So there's an example of Colorado. Florida, apparently their state bird recently became the flamingo. People aren't too happy about that. Alabama, and many, many other states. Again, a symbol that signifies you belong, you understand, you have friends everywhere. But it's not just domestic. Taking over the Andor subreddit were examples of international rebel birds, a veritable rebel fleet of birds. Right, so Norway, someone posting saying, stay strong, Americans, you have friends in Norway. You have friends all over Mexico. You have even more friends in New Zealand. So we're echoing this, you have friends everywhere, right? That becomes a sort of passkey to get involved. So what does this all mean? Well, so I made a word cloud of the posts and the comments that I was scraping from our Andor. And this is what came up. Remember is so big because it's so central to Nemec's manifesto. It's sort of the repeated motif right throughout his manifesto. But I think this represents how people are merging Star Wars, sorry, faux pas, Star Wars, and the real world, right? What's up here? Epstein, referenced incredibly frequently. So does this matter, right? Is this going to sort of break out of this sort of sci-fi fantasy nerds and spread in the way that the Rebel Alliance starts to spread and cohere? And I kept coming back to that poster who said that Andor is pertinent and thinking about the way that these symbols and ideas translate and move across space and time. And what was co-occurring as the Rebel logo became more and more common in protests was the way that celebrities were sort of obliquely referencing things at the Golden Globes, the Grammys, and the Olympics. So this was sold as a set of pins. So that's the Rebel loon with Ice Out and the Pretty Good. GQ called Ice Out the celebrity accessory of the moment. I think, again, raising questions about how meaningful, right, or impactful is this. But you start to see sort of celebrities making statements or wearing things that are connecting with what the protesters are saying. So if you scrape the celebrity statements from the Golden Globes and the Olympics, here's what you get. It's a different message. What's centered here is country, America, love, people, united. Same thing, just smaller. Right? And so I think we see how this message starts to shift and adapt. It's about love for country, the idea that everyone matters, the need for freedom and to stand together. There's less of an emphasis in these statements on remember, because they're not directly quoting Nemec, right? And resistance. But it still shows up in ways that makes headlines, right? So Glennon Doyle and Abby Wambach at the Oscars red carpet with the fuck eyes clutch, right? Bedazzled, you can't really see that in the picture, but it's a bedazzled fuck eyes clutch, right? And so if we combine these sort of two, you can call them corpuses, here's what you get, right? This sense that there is a sort of commonality of message here and that adaptability is what really matters, that people are seeing themselves reflected, adapting it to their situations, and sort of seeing themselves in what other people are saying. As we hear in Andor, right, it just keeps spreading. And this was posted after the James Talarico interview with Stephen Colbert was sort of banned from the air, right? And so does it matter, right, if these ideas spread, if they're not followed by political action? Right? And so I think, you know, this question about try versus do really comes back. When the Talarico stuff happened, someone wrote on the Andor subreddit, are we really at the stage of characterizing sort of generic Democratic politicians like this guy as revolutionaries, right? He's moralizing about the virtue of treating fascists with respect. And so I think there is a real deeper question here about, does this philosophy of try legitimize doing what many see as the bare minimum as a sort of noble struggle? I think I'm going to say no. And I'm going to show you no in my remaining minute and a half by turning to Thailand and some other international places. So in February, early February 2026, someone from Thailand posted this on Reddit, that Thailand rarely sees its democracy bloom with 13 successful military coups on record. Today is our election day, and the green lightsaber color highlighting the words there, right, is given the scale of our opponents and their tyrannical support and attempt to make us concede to the very last moment, I think of Nemec. May we never stop trying. And this person was so inspired that they actually rewrote Nemec's manifesto to be slightly longer and more specific to Thailand, right? And so that's copied up here. The words are less important than the sort of action of doing this, right? Of copying your specific local context into this overarching manifesto. Iran, January 30th, 2026, was posted this, talking about the scene with the Gormans and how that felt painfully familiar. That a fictional world I've loved since childhood suddenly didn't feel fictional at all. And the person cried, not because it was fiction, but because it wasn't. So again, recognizing one's experience in this show with the language to then talk about it in ways that might otherwise be taboo. Here's another poster from Iran, a different person posting in early February, who notes, I never wanted to be political, but they recognize their story and experiences in Andor. And Andor is undeniably political. And I think this fascination the person has with how the rebellion was formed and came together really shows how Andor, the symbols, and I think Nemec's manifesto are a really key part of taking a sort of ragtag group of organizations and individuals and turning it into a much denser network where people have sort of shared ideas, shared symbols, and shared passwords of belonging, right? The I have friends everywhere. And so I think to connect to what Sarah Parkinson said last night in the introduction to the Andor episodes, that sometimes the very act of showing up is in fact meaningful political action. Because the protesters who show up, whether in the United States or in Thailand or Iran, take on that risk of being present. That when faced with an armed hostile regime, presence puts oneself at risk and makes it a political act that goes beyond the symbolic or the performative. I will end there. Thank you. Judy, yes.
Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Silvana Toska, who is an international relations and Middle East scholar focusing on political psychology. Her first book looks at the role of emotions for revolutionary diffusion and success, and she is currently working on a book on the role of emotions in nuclear crises. None of this is fun. To make up for it, she has become the professor who has a movie reference for every concept and war theory she teaches, and in this past year, most of them come from Andor. And when students feel depressed about the political moment we are living in, she reminds them to rewatch the final episode of the series and the sad look on Dedra Miro's face when she realizes that a cold, heartless, fascist regime will eventually eat its own.
Okay, I'm very excited to talk about this. I'm going to be teaching this as a course next year, so it's a good, it's a great opportunity for me to think about this. So when Patrick and I guess a few of you were watching Star Wars in your childhood, I was actually fighting fascism in mine. I grew up in Albania, so when Eastern European revolutions fell, Albania was after all of the other ones. And that particular moment, even though I was a child, we were out in the streets. I watched everything that was unfolding, and so my neighbors and relatives, essentially who were never political until that moment, out in the streets and protesting. And the one thing that, again, I didn't have the means to analyze this. I just witnessed. But what everybody kept saying around me was like, I am just so freaking angry. Everything that was happening and every action by the government. And they were out there in the streets. So we overthrew the government in 1991. And then the new government, it took it about, I don't know, a year and a half to become like the previous one. So we overthrew them again in 1997. But then I was a bit old, so I could actually pay greater attention to what was going on. And everything that I thought, about revolutions involved emotions, because as a young child, as a teenager, that's what this was for me, just a bunch of angry people being out in the streets. And then I was in Cairo thinking about a dissertation topic when the Arab uprisings essentially started. And as I'm reading a lot more about revolutions and revolutionary waves, and I want to understand that particular moment, the one thing that I felt was really missing, and this came so much from my own personal experiences, and what I then saw on the square, was this fact that the revolutionists are talking about everything they're seeing as anger or overcoming of fear. And the literature doesn't do a lot of that. So this quote, rebellions are built on hope, which was the episode that we watched last night, so that's episode 8. This was added late in Andor, and mostly because Gilroy's son, essentially said that you need to tie it in with the Star Wars universe in general, where they're actually talking. Leia mentions this, Rogue One mentions this, and we need to have it here. And so they eventually included rebellions are built on hope. And I find this really fascinating, because hope is indeed a really powerful emotion. It's we see it in every revolution. But in Andor, the most important emotion that we see essentially propelling mobilization is actually anger. And we have this, emotions in general have a bad rep, because they're counter to rationality. If you're making emotional decisions, that's inherently a bad one. And anger is even worse. But hopefully I'll convince you that actually emotions in general, and anger in particular, is really necessary. It's a necessary emotion, and it is a foundation for a lot of revolutionary mobilization. So I want to restore and make us proud of being angry at times. So the main points I've already highlighted a little bit, but I'll go over it in a second. I'll talk a little bit more nerdy theories of revolution to situate why actually talking about emotions is actually, there's 2 other scholars that have worked on emotions during the Arab uprisings, but until then, it just wasn't really a thing. And Andor essentially captures what a lot of us witnessed and studied during mobilization in general. Then I'll tell you a little bit more about how the literature in psychology talks about emotions and revolutionary mobilization. So I would argue that for revolutionary mobilization to take hold, you actually need emotional mobilization to precede it. I'll talk about the connection between structures versus this emotional mobilization, but you actually need it, and every revolution that has ever happened had quite a bit of it. And in Andor, we see anger and hope essentially coexist together. And that stripping emotions out of revolutionary politics, which is what most revolutionary politics does, it's like painting an exploding volcano without red lava. This was my advisor responding to my dissertation proposal when I said, can I do this? And he sat out his Peter Katzenstein, and I was like, okay, let's go. As Sarah mentioned, I'm working on a second book that is looking at decision-making in crisis moments of crisis, and specifically looking at nuclear crisis. And I'm looking at 1973 Israeli discussions around potentially using nuclear weapons against Arab states. And the reason that I'm really interested in this, because again, I'm a scholar of political psychology. I'm interested in the role of emotions in decision-making. And I absolutely love Dr. Strange. I assigned that for my intro to IR classes as well. And as I'm researching this book, I find this anecdote where Stanley Kubrick, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he goes to Thomas Schelling, whom I'm sure we all know, won the Nobel Prize for a lot of his models of rational choice. And Stanley Kubrick goes to Schelling and says, I want to make a movie, a film, about how nuclear war can actually start. And Schelling tells him that there is no plausible path towards a nuclear war, and goes through the theory that, it's like going to doing something like a nuclear war. Essentially, you're committing suicide. Think of the 2 climbers that tied together on the side of a cliff. If one falls, the other one does. It's irrational. They're not going to do that. There's absolutely no utility to going to, having a nuclear war. Well, Kubrick was like, that's crazy. So he made Dr. Strange of it. And I think I'm writing my book that, should have deserved a Nobel Prize for this, because it's really quite a good theory. But the literature, though, for so long, focuses on two things that explain both how revolutions essentially happen and how they spread. The structural conditions or opportunity structure. So, you have conditions of exploitation, you've got means of mobilizing, so you've got early adopters and organizational structures, and the mechanisms through which you essentially utilize what you already have in place is through these rational actors, or bounded irrational if they're being a bit more open about it. But you need this split, like this captures a lot of revolutionary theories. And rationality, obviously, it is used a lot more in economics, but obviously political science talks quite a bit about it. It assumes that we act very purposefully, and we make choices that are ordered, and those choices are going to be consistent the next time that we encounter a similar situation, because we have order preferences. We are utility maximizers, and then sacrifice or death is you're not maximizing any utility by essentially putting yourself in danger. So sacrifice, suicide, death, and putting yourself in danger in rebellion, there's absolutely no personal utility to that. So therefore, it's not really a rational decision. So again, the literature on revolutions is enormous, and I'm only focusing on this rationality nexus here. But the conclusion, and as I summarize the literature in my book, I looked at how, given these objective structural factors of fascism and opportunities presented to potential challengers, then the challengers will exploit those opportunities and structures and rebel. I'll go a bit fast on this because, again, it's but it does highlight how cool Andor is. So the two predominant theories that are studied on revolutionary mobilization, the first one is Ted Gurr on relative deprivation theories. He wrote this book in 1970 that discusses whether it is greed versus grievance that makes people rebel. And he argues that it's actually afforded aspirations, so which arise out of rational calculations of what one has versus what one believes you ought to have. And that is sufficient to spark revolt. This is the mechanisms through which he argues revolts happen. But rationality remains very crucial to Gurr. And then Charles Steele in 1973 says, well, actually, no, because we see grievances all the time, and yet rebellions are not happening with the kind of frequency that you would expect given the grievances. So he says that we actually need opportunity structures. We need those early adopters, we need mobilizers, people that can essentially mobilize resources such as territory, arms, and popular allegiance, use narratives, convert people to the revolution. You need to create this revolutionary coalition to eventually overthrow the regime. So it's not a given, you need both things. And we see them both in Andor. I mean, you cannot examine what's happening in Andor without looking at the grievances of a population that is being repressed by the Empire. And you also cannot talk about Andor without rebellion and Luther himself, all the work that he's putting through to essentially do exactly what Charles Steele is talking about in terms of mobilizing those resources for rebellion. So they're not incorrect. They are important. This is a really important part of rebellion, but they're woefully incomplete, say. So Gurr argues, where there is a will, because you're upset, you're angry. Well, he doesn't say angry, I shouldn't have said. Because you rationally calculate that the situation is disadvantageous to you, then there is a way, you're going to rebel. And Steele says, where there is a way, there is a will. Steele looks at the structures of mobilization, and that somehow will essentially lead to actual rebellion. And there's a certain determinism that is devoid of both emotions and contingency in their analysis, unless in the theory, unless you're careful and you go to the cases themselves. And then when you go to the cases, what you see is that implicitly emotions do a lot of the work in both of their theories. So when Gurr talks about when there is a will, there is a way, I said the word anger. In the stories of revolutionaries, there's a lot of anger that he's talking about, but he just never theorizes it. So it's there. And my very favorite, and I actually do love this book a lot, it's Kurt Wayland's 2009 book on the 1848 revolutionary waves in Europe. He actually writes repeatedly in the book, cognitive heuristics And he talks about rationality and bounded rationality, come emotions. And when I first read this, I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, they're not the same thing. Because his theory is so much about, you see something that is so powerful, like the revolutionary parrots, and you think you can emulate it, and therefore you go out on the street and you do it. And he doesn't distinguish between he calls it a boundedly rational theory of mobilization. But the word emotions kind of are there, so he recognizes them, just fails to really theorize them. And yesterday, as I was looking over the slides for the last time, I actually saw these two books that just came out by non-academics on the Arrow crisis. So The Days of Love and Rage, and then Defiance, a memoir of awakening, rebellion, and survival in Syria. They seem like fantastic books, and I put them in my cart and I can't wait to read them. And for those of us who spend a lot of time in the Middle East at this time, obviously the protest days were called Days of Rage. And death of fear was, the most common phrase used by revolutionaries against their regimes. So nobody in the field would be surprised by this. And one of my favorite quotes, I use this in my theory chapter in the book, it's to call it mass hypnosis is not quite right, but the mood of the crowd was transmitted from one to another like conduction, like a spontaneous burst of laughter, joy, or anger. And this is Edward Dune, a Moscow teenager participating in 1917 October Revolution in China Neville's October. It's a fantastic book if you haven't read it, highly recommend it. And throughout this book, even this, Marxist, the most structural theory, recognize that you need to play and mobilize people's emotions if you're going to have them out in the streets. And the way the revolutionaries talk about it is exactly like this. So rationally, rebellion does not necessarily make sense when you could potentially put yourself and your loved ones in danger. And I would say the person who more clearly gets it in Andor is Saw Gerrera. So in season 2, episode 5, he says, revolution is an unstable collection of three things: intense emotion, politics, and luck. And obviously we cannot theorize contingency and luck, but we have mostly focused on politics. We have focused, whether it's political scientists, focus like structures of oppression, and we obviously see a lot of that in Andor, or whether it's Tilly-like opportunity structures, we see that in Lufan as a challenger that mobilizes resources. We do far less of the intense emotion part. But I love this next quote in Saw Gerrera's little monologue there, that revolution is not for the same. And I wish I'd seen this before, because that would have featured prominently in my work. And there is evidence of this throughout Andor. You can see Mon Mothma, who has, a very cushy life. She's very privileged. She is personally unlikely to suffer the consequences of empire if she toes the line. Nevertheless, she's putting herself at risk. And she asks at what cost, both to herself, to the people that get involved and eventually die because of their actions. And nobody is more aware of the personal cost than Luthen. He's radicalized following the event where he met Playa Markey and her people essentially being killed. And he talks directly about what is my sacrifice. I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see, etc., etc. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I've made my mind a sunless space. And then finally, I burn my decency for someone else's future. This is not exactly your utility maximizing rebel out there. He's benefiting very little himself. But again, the structures and opportunity structures are very important for mobilization, because at the beginning of the series, Cassian, he has a lot of anger. His whole family, his whole planet has been destroyed. He's trying to find his sister. But that anger doesn't have any way to be channeled. So he's this angry individual, he's a thief. That's a rational thing for him to do, just focus on himself, focus on trying to figure out where his sister is. So the cost of participating in rebellion is too high. He's not convinced of it. It's nothing to him. So you do need the Luthans and the early mobilizers, essentially what Tilly argues. But without Andor's extreme anger, it's unlikely to see him join Luthen. And in fact, he doesn't at the beginning. It wasn't sufficient for him to see that there was a necessity to participate in rebellion. Things change a little bit in Narkina 5. What he sees there obviously leads to a lot of anger, the exploitation, the murder that happens in Narkina 5. It radicalizes Andor. So, he does start to feel that anger. And then obviously Marva's death exacerbates that even further. And the posthumous speech that Marva gives when she talks about, fight these bastards, she's very much trying to mobilize the population, trying to mobilize their anger, and have them essentially out and participating in fight against the Empire. So this is a moment where Andor, yes, he does have hope, because Narkina 5 is an example of at least doing something against an empire, if not defeating the empire. But it isn't really hope that is getting Andor really riled up, I would say. It is the fact that he's grieving that leads to anger. And grief is not one of the, political psychology doesn't talk about grief as one of the foundational emotions, but it is a really important emotion that has secondary effects as well. And if you know the cause of that grief, then you're likely to appraise that situation in such a way that your grief turns to anger, because you want to fix it, you want to address it. And something like grief that is not fixable is likely to have this enormous amount of anger. So Andor is now very angry. And together with Luthen's opportunity structures, we have a rebellion. So this idea of manipulating emotions is really common in Andor. This scene is the one that I mentioned yesterday, where Ramiro talks, she specifically says about how to essentially repress Gorman. She says propaganda can only get you so far. You need a radical insurgency you can count on. You need Gorman rebels to do the wrong thing. And in my work right now on nuclear weapons, when I'm looking at the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is precisely the psychological effect. It's studied a lot about the strategic reasons why the bombs were dropped. But just as often as strategic reasons, it's the psychological ones that are discussed in the decision making, and it's terrifying, and it sounds very much like this. Let's drop the bomb because it's just going to have such an enormous reaction. And Luthen, who's so self-aware about both of his positions and the tools that he's using, this quote that is obviously so famous now, that I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them, he wants the same thing as the Empire when it comes to Gorman. And this is what led to the split between Luthen and Andor. So we talked about the narrative control. Empire wants narrative control when Mon Mothma leaves, and rebels want the exact same thing. But they want the same kind of psychological effects and emotional mobilization as well. So Luthen also wants Gorman rebels to do the wrong thing, because that, he hopes, will have enough psychological impact that other people in the universe would essentially rebel. And he says in season 1, episode 7, we need the fear. We need them, Gorman, essentially, to overreact. So the recognition that you need an emotional reaction to get people to use the tools that Luthen and other early adopters are offering is really important. And I love how well Andor does it. It makes my job explaining my book much easier. But it misunderstands the emotions that are necessary. So when Luthen says that we need the fear, but fear is pervasive already, and fear is demobilizing. I'll show you a chart in the next slide about how fear doesn't really get you out in the streets. There's one condition in different democracies that I discuss, how that can lead to mobilization. Fear is demobilizing. What you actually need is hope, anger, anything that can be more powerful than that fear. And here is Andor taking, this is the first episode of season 2, where he is stealing the ship. And he tells a young, new recruit that you're coming home to yourself. You've become more than your fear. Let that protect you. And Narkina 5 is also all about turning fear into hope. The whole episodes that are in Narkina 5 that's what Andor is essentially doing. So I look at the main emotions and their appraisal tendencies and their action tendencies in revolutionary mobilization. So for example, you can see fear on top. I'm not going to go over all of them, but essentially, if you're fearful of something, then you're likely to pay particular attention to danger. You don't want to stray or deviate from whatever road or whatever path you have taken so far. You are very biased towards low risk. Essentially, it's very strong. So what you do as a result, you are paralyzed. Instead of fighting, you're going to stop. And that's the opposite for anger and hatred. Humiliation and shame can have both effects. So some emotions essentially can have appraisal tendencies and action tendencies that are the opposite. So humiliation and shame can both paralyze and mobilize, depending on whether you can effectively articulate what is causing this humiliation and shame and whether you can essentially fight it. And I would say grief operates in the same way, that it can be paralyzing and mobilizing as well. And grief is a really fascinating one because during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, it's hard to talk about the success of revolution without all the Friday funerals and the grief and the participation and the repetition of the circles. And we saw that during the Arab uprisings a little bit as well. So I call this the emotional behavioral circumflex, where you have mobilizing emotions. The green line essentially is where you want to be in order to be able to mobilize people into a revolution. You want mobilizing emotions, you want hope, you want anger and hatred. It's not a comfortable thing for a lot of people because we want a movement that's full of love and optimism. But anger actually is really quite productive. And you want to be low on paralyzing emotions, and they don't disappear. A lot of protesters during the Arab uprisings, a lot of my relatives participating in 1997 in Albania, they were very fearful. They were very aware that they could be killed anytime they were out in the streets. But it's the balance between high emotions, high mobilizing emotions, and paralyzing ones that really matter. And in my book, I also show how they're really important to sustain rebellion. And in fact, when you have, when things happen, that things are in a lull, there's no emotional event, you can essentially see the networks of rebellion kind of like falling apart. And then something will happen that will jolt, will bring this emotional intensity back into the movement. And you'll see those events essentially, the movement coalesce again. And usually it is something really powerful like death, and we saw it in Minnesota, that it had this massive mobilizing effects. And this is also why it's very difficult to have empires forever, because there's always the possibility that you can move on the will. People are not stable on their emotions. Events happen that could move from an emotion of fear to that of anger, and especially if you have these early mobilizers that could explain, could create a narrative around a rebellion, that it makes revolution much more likely. I don't have time to talk about the Expanse. It is actually my favorite. Because I teach a lot more international relations courses, I do a lot more about balance of power and deterrence, etc. I talk a lot about nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, protomolecule in the Expanse. But the one thing that I want to leave you with here is that historically, angry women in television series, I mean, they are not taken seriously. Like they are, or life. They are shrewd and hysterical. And what the Expanse does, I mean, it challenges the stereotypes of women. And here you have Naomi Nagata and a drummer who's queer, and Naomi Nagata, a woman of color, who not only have a lot of anger for very justified reasons, the oppression of the belt, but they use it effectively. I mean, it drives the narrative. Their anger is so powerful in driving the narrative and what happens in the world of the Expanse. Underneath this whole, weapons of mass destruction, that it's easy to miss. It's easy to miss that it is actually anger that propels their action, and it is very productive, and it is being unfairly maligned. So next time you see students or yourself, you're really angry about something, I actually think we need to kind of embrace that, as opposed to pushing it down for a more for an easier narrative of just hope.
We have 15 minutes for questions. Want to come to the front?
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. One question for each. So, question for Jim about. I was struck by one of the slides. And you talk about the way that these mimetic drawings from Andor are engaging in. I don't think you actually used this phrase, but it was a phrase that kind of occurred to me of a sort of popular allegory. Like that people, actors themselves, are sort of drawing allegorical mappings between things that were happening in Andor and Star Wars and things that were happening in their daily experiences. I'm curious as to how you think about the relationship between that kind of popular allegory and like allegorical readings that scholars might do. Like, do popular allegories have to be sort of constrained by like valid scholarly readings of the text? Is there more agency and flexibility here? Is what you're interested in really just that kind of the use, or is there a connection between that and whatever sort of mappings we might do? So I'm curious about how you sort of think about the kind of the possible tension or overlap between those two. So I'd love you to talk a little more about that. With the emotions sets of questions, I mean, I'm compelled to bring up Yoda's line in episode 1 about emotion, which is of course that fear leads to anger, and anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering, and that's why you shouldn't go down that road. And it is clear to me, and I would definitely argue, that Star Wars adheres to that line as its sort of take on things in ways that the Expanse obviously doesn't, because the Expanse is sci-fi, and so it works in a different way. There isn't a kind of mythic mark to it. There's an epic, to go back to the suggestion about epics morning. I mean, the Expanse is clearly a space opera kind of epic, but it isn't a myth in that sort of sense. I wonder how you're reading, or how you think about the difference between the reading that you're doing and what Star Wars seems to be saying, which is a very different kind of approach to thinking about emotions and praising not anger. The angry characters and the characters who get angry usually turn out to be bad ones, and it usually goes to bad ends in various ways. So I'm curious about how you sort of think about the kind of tension, both as a scholar and to go back to the sort of place you started to talk, as a teacher. Because of course, there is great pedagogical value of showing these things to students. And I wonder about that because you're sort of reading the text kind of against itself. And I wonder how much you draw that out in the classroom for students, or how you kind of play with that tension. So those are my two questions.
Yeah, right. So I do think you're right that the sort of internet gremlins see Andor, the sort of allegory, right, for what they're going through. Though I don't know if any of them would use that term, right? I think for them it's a much more sort of like, there's no metaphor here. It's sort of, this is my life. I am seeing my life reflected in this. And I think a way that scholars sometimes like to not overcomplicate, but sometimes complexify things that I think have a sort of very direct and straightforward application and meaning. And I think that's what I'm seeing in the Reddit, in the celebrity, in the Olympic statement is there's deep thought to the extent that people are watching something, seeing symbols, reading the manifesto, and thinking deeply enough about their own lives that resonates. But I don't think it's deep thought in the sense of people are thinking about sort of literary genres and allegories, right? And so I think one of the things that drew me to this was the real immediacy and sort of like thingness of it, right? That like you're seeing protest signs, right? As you've held, as I've held, right, at protests with Andor on them, right? In a way that I think is very direct and in your face and doesn't actually sort of skirt like the allegorical meaning of what is Plato's The Cave, right? It's like, no, this is in fact fascism.
Yeah.
I'm going to call it out. And like, let's call a fascist spade, right? So I think there's a directness here that's actually deeply sort of interesting. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now.
But it's Plato's Cave on Dagobah.
Right.
So I love this question. It's a fantastic question, and it's one that I've been thinking about for a while, meaning since Andor started and I got introduced to Star Wars. which, by the way, it's a different experience being introduced as an adult. But for me, though, this is why, the myth of Star Wars versus the more reality of Andor. This is why I prefer Andor. This is why, to me, it's closer to reality, because it is true that it attempts to remain somewhat loyal to the original by focusing on hope, by focusing on emotions that, go against the force and the balance. And yes, anger is bad and hate and suffering, but Andor cannot, because it doesn't deal with the force so much, then it's free to examine things that I think are actually more realistic, more applicable to us, not more realistic. That's not a good way to put it. So I think that's just more applicable to how we study politics in the real world. And Andor is able to do that because it doesn't focus enough with the force. But because it's still operating with the same universe, is not honest about addressing that anger is actually really powerful. It still tries to talk about it as if it's hope that makes you participate. But obviously, Cassian himself he's full of anger and he uses it, and that's good. And I think for my students, I teach also like violent versus non-violent movements and what makes them successful, and that there's been this long-term bias against violent movements, against this anger. And we talk about Mandela, we talk about Gandhi, without looking at the whole history of Mandela's participation in protests, which was not all non-violent. And it was productive because it created the movement, and you wouldn't have such a powerful movement. Again, it's hard to sparse out. Would we have had the same kind of anti-apartheid movements if Mandela was all along so calm and talking about non-violence? So there is a real value to that anger, even if it goes against the original ethos of Star Wars.
So maybe I had this conversation with Silvana before, but if you've are familiar with Paul Lindbarger, who wrote about psychological warfare and also wrote science fiction under the name Cordwainer Smith. So that might be interesting to investigate if you haven't. We have a question that for you also that asks what it would look like to reframe anger through the lens of Audre Lorde, and it cites her work, The Uses of Anger. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Not enough to be able to comfortably give a good answer.
Damn, that's a good question.
No. But I will look it up today, that's for sure.
Yeah, we had 2 questions.
2 questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go. I'm Allie. My research interest is also in this vein, so of interdisciplinary integrating fiction, like film or media into IR. So I guess I'm doing a little bit of assuming here, but if you come up against opposition to the seriousness or importance of this work, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? And I think, sometimes the standard advice is, don't participate in the ISA Star Wars panel as a graduate student or an early career academic because you won't be serious, right? And I think that there is part of the discipline, right, that says that. I think there is a sort of growing recognition that sometimes the universes in which these fictional worlds are set actually open space to talk about things that can't otherwise be talked about. And why should we, for example, look down on Star Wars or Star Trek or The Expanse when we're taking all sorts of other types of literature, right? What is it that makes it okay to look at, I'm not a really literature person, right? But like some canonical literature and say, this is worthy of study, whereas Star Wars isn't. And I think one of the things I appreciate about Patrick's sort of opening framing was just the real depth and complexity, right? In the way that you can use fiction, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, or I don't know, the Odyssey, right? To sort of look for parallels, for themes, for politics in it. And so my sort of snarky response to someone who's like, well, that's not real political science would be why? Can you articulate to me a clear reason for why this is not like any other type of research, right? And I think until someone can do that, my sort of inclination is maybe to not take as seriously that type of critique, which I know is a risky position to feel like you're putting yourself in, but I do think, yeah, that's valuable.
Right? No, sorry.
So I get the fear, as a graduate student, I would have been concerned, but there's a way to do this that is, which I think we did, which is, you're grounding it in international relations. In my next book, I'm very much grounding it in theory, in psychology, but I'm talking quite a bit about the Expanse because it illustrates the same way as, Schelling talks about those two individuals, if one falls, the other falls, there's a lot of this anecdotes in his book to illustrate complicated theories. I use that the same way to explain how emotions may lead to a disaster, essentially, when it comes to crisis decision making. So, again, post tenure, it's easier to do. But if anybody were to say that this is like, what are you doing with the Expanse? I think I can comfortably say, do you have a better way to explain, or why is this worse than Schelling giving me this analogy of these two people on a cliff? And do you have a better way to explain this? And what is the logical inconsistency here? And if there is none, but post tenure.
I appreciate it.
It's basically something saying the professional urinary. And I live for it. No, so I think a couple of different things. One, to sort of riff off of Jen's point, I think that there is or has been an allergy among certain sectors of the American public to talking politics. And I think that Star Wars, The Expanse, Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek actually provide a really important opening that, especially as it can be harder to talk about our own politics, these are accessible texts, right? Like there are just only so many people who are going to read Plato, for example, right? But can I speak to undergraduates or high school students who can grasp the concepts in Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica? And the answer is yes. And so I do think that there is something about making politics accessible. I also think that many of the showrunners involved in Star Wars, many of the authors involved in like the sort of greater cultural production around the Star Wars universe. I think about the writers for The Expanse, for example. I have said to students, the representations of military sociology in The Expanse are extraordinarily accurate to reality. I actually would argue that like the showrunner for Star Wars, the work that the actors did, I've forgotten her name, but the actor who plays Cinta is like, yeah, we sat there and read memoirs and read Shoot the Women First, which I understand why that book is titled what it is. It's not my favorite, but I would argue that many of these actors, showrunners, writers are taking the politics of the people they're representing more seriously than many social scientists are willing to do. And I think that that's important, right? Where we're going to try to build, or where I would argue that a lot of social scientists try to build a theory on top of and distance themselves from, rather than taking seriously the words that are actually coming out of the mouths of someone like Leila Khalid, sorry, not Lala Khalidi, but Lala, credit to you too for writing a book on memory in Palestinian communities. But Leila Khalid, right? Like, where people are like, well, why would you read her memoir? And it's like, no, the actors who are involved in these shows are going to go back and read what she's saying and take that seriously. So those would be my 2 points on this. I wrote a piece pre-tenure, and it's probably still the most read thing that I've ever published. Something like 22,000 people read that piece. Right?
I sign it.
Because I really do think that there's something about, I do think depending on what your sort of orientation is in the academy, are you sort of, how are you making what we do accessible? Right? But the trick is doing so, and that's not something that's taught in graduate programs. Right?
Verada Seppi.
Hmm?
Verada Seppi.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
So this, I have a question for both of you, but I don't have like the formation for my question for Sylvia. It's still working, so I'll ask you later. Jen, if I'm playing like grad school semantics, got you question stuff, just smack me in the hand and keep it moving. But and I've been struggling with this since last night. I'm struggling with seeing the difference between there is no try and try in the context in which both of those are described, right? Because if I'm getting this right, the do or not do is the scene where Luke is like refusing to lift the X-Wing from the water. And then Mimic is giving his manifesto. And in both instances, I see I'm going to call them thinkers since we're doing political science thing, as articulating a demand to move from a place of stasis, right? In both ways, right? So like, help me understand the distinction between the two and why that distinction is important and sort of fleshing out what you're proposing here.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Brian. I think that's a fantastic question. And I think what it highlights is the different scale of the tasks, right? So Yoda is saying to Luke, do or not do, there is no try, right? Luke is a force powerful being. He can lift the rocks. He's just sort of unwilling to give into acknowledging sort of his connection to the force, right? Potentially his greater purpose. And so I think there's an accomplishability, I don't know,
I hear
yeah,
Yeah.
accomplishability and an immediacy to the do, right? Whereas what I see Nemec doing is saying there is a do, but it's actually quite far down the line. We are not sort of going to be able to snap our fingers and tap the force like Luke to raise the rocks. We are going to have to try and struggle and fail and take this sort of winding longer path until we get to do. And so I think there's a time horizon gap there, right? Where Yoda's like, just do, man, just do. And Nemec is like, well, we can't just do. We're a ragtag group of people who all kind of don't get along. We must try before we can do.
I like that. I would go just one slight step further.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna like this, but because again, I think the in the context of Star Wars, every being is connected to the Force in some way. So maybe that's one of the rules of the universe, right? They may not all be as powerful as those, but they're all sort of connected. And in that sense, one, I think, can read, maybe this isn't the way Nemec would read it, but this is sort of the way that I think a viewer who is sort of looking at the mythology would read it. Nemec's try is leave space for the Force to do its thing. So do what you do without worrying so much about are you going to succeed, are you going to fail? Do it. And then you kind of allow things to work out. So that's the faith part, right? That's the sort of the background hope bit that's sort of in there. And it's not foregrounded in Nemec's manifesto, and it's not really foregrounded in a number of because the narrative camera in Andor was very close to these sort of non-force sensitive people, right? So you're sort of getting their version of it. But from a broader narrative perspective, right, we all know what this is adding up to. We all know that these little acts of things that they're doing do actually kind of like allow the stream of the will of the Force to eventually sort of do what it needs to do that. And that would be much more of I don't want to use the word religious, but you could say religious or at least a faith-based way of thinking about what's going on in this. And that way there wouldn't be any ultimate inconsistency, both because of the time horizon question and because of all right, what kind of space are you leaving for the I don't know, it's not actually a long durée, but a longer durée, right? Of the sort of the flow of things kind of going through it. So in that sense, and back to the sort of Taoist thing, right? That would mean that they're not actually opposites, but they're complementary.
Well, it's like, I think the way that Nemec, right, so the manifesto starts with sort of freedom is a pure idea, right? It occurs spontaneously. And I know that, maybe Nemec's manifesto doesn't explicitly reference the Force, but in some ways, the idea that this thing occurs spontaneously, that everyone's tapping into and ultimately working towards, even when they don't know it, right? I think that is the Force, right? So I think in a way there actually is a sort of deep connection here, right? That this thing, this try leaves space for the Force to do its thing, yeah, right? And that's through trying through freedom, right? We're sort of letting this invisible hand of freedom that occurs spontaneously throughout the galaxy guide us towards what we need to do. And so I actually do see a pretty deep connection here to the Force. I never thought that would be the conversation I would be.
I think there's something about like the collective that Nemec is also implying, right? Like he's talking about collective affect. That doesn't have to articulate that as the Force, but there's something that's actually resonant in the way that he's talking about it as non-Force sensitive, where he is fundamentally talking about collective affect in this sort of like emotions as the micro foundations type of thing. But also, like, not to get shady on Luke, but to get shady on Luke, like Nemec's actually much more emotionally mature than Luke is.
Oh my God. Yes.
Like part of why Yoda says what he says to Luke at that point is like, you're being whiny.
Yeah.
Right? And Nemec is like in it.
Yeah.
Like he's writing this as he's living in the woods to like risk his life in this operation and then winds up dying from it, right? Like, and Luke is still like frustrated that he had to wait one more season to go to the academy. Like,
But part of the genius of Star Wars is you both.
right,
You
absolutely.
need Nemec's manifesto and kind of work that it does in mobile life. But you also need Luke to figure out that you don't actually kill Darth Vader.
Right. And that's the balance, right? Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions? Anyone online?
No, I think we brought balance to the Force.
I guess.
I think pretty accomplished along that.
Yeah, we could take a break for lunch.
All right.
Thank you.
Good, thank you.